For those who don't know, I'm David Wilkins. I'm the faculty director of the Center on the Legal Profession. This is our, semi-regular speaker series where we try to bring amazing people to campus to interact with students to talk about what they do and, how they got there, what they see the issues are that are facing the legal profession. Please come on in. There's food over here. And to give all of you an opportunity to chat. Oh, maybe it's the wrong room. Okay. I don't think that was reflected on you. Maybe on me. I don't know. Or on our food. Maybe there's better food someplace else. As I told Carol, the idea is to really have a conversation, and so, she said, I don't want to make speeches. She gives enough of those already. So I'm going to kind of begin things by having an informal conversation, and then we'll open it up to all of you. But if during the course of Carol and I talking, you have something you'd like to ask or clarify or raise an objection to, please feel free to do so. We're recording this because we're going to put this up on our YouTube channel. We told Carol in case she says anything impolitic that we'll show it to her first. But you might
makes
just
me want to
wary.
say something impolitic.
We would love for you to say something impolitic, and it's definitely that time. So I don't forget, this is Brian Fung, who's our research director, and Tim Shea is over here, and my assistant Sarah Freeman, and that's Sonali, who's our intern from Northeastern, interested in going to law school, so please speak to her about any thoughts you have about going to law school. We would absolutely appreciate it. Next week, we're going to have another of these. They kind of come when we can get interesting people here, and this is going to be on a career study that I've been working on for now like 20 years, called the After the JD study, and the lead researcher is a guy named Bob Nelson. He's going to come talk about what we've learned about legal careers over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think for those of you particularly just starting out but interested in where your careers might go, not just as soon as you graduate, but in 5 years or 10 years, I think you might find this very interesting in this room, right, Brian? Okay, so that's kind of the preliminaries. Listen, it gives me great pleasure to be here with Carol Rose, and it's not just because she's my former student, and I'm very proud of everything that she has accomplished since graduation, but she actually has done amazing things even before she came, and we were just talking about how unusual it was. She had been out of college for 10 years. She was a war correspondent. You might be interested in talking about that, or the intersection of journalism and law, which I think has really prepared her very well in many ways for her current role. She was also a law clerk for Judge Patty Saris, who many of you know, who teaches here and who's an amazing person still on the court. She worked at a law firm, and she now has been for several years the director of the ACLU here in Massachusetts, where, as the Chinese might say, she has been able to live in interesting times. And we're going to try to talk a little bit about that, but my guess is many of you have questions about that as well, and Carol, I know for a fact, will answer your questions as directly as she possibly can, so please feel free to ask them. Carol, I'm just going to start kind of more with the biography. I mean, you've had all of these really interesting parts of your life, and maybe if you could just say a few words to the students, both about kind of why you decided to come to law school, what law school was like for you, and then kind of the career steps that have taken you to where you are today.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you, David. I have to tell you guys, he was like one of my very favorite, maybe the very favorite teacher that I had at Harvard Law School. And so while you might be feeling like, oh, I should be like studying my contracts, no, this is what you should be thinking about, is sort of what your life path is. And so I might just offer, first of all, in terms of how I think about how we build a professional career path as lawyers, and as human beings. One thing I would say is a career path, I only actually see mine in the rearview mirror. I'm a big believer that really what you do is you get open for an opportunity and you make a play. So making a pass is an important skill set that we all need to learn how to do when we work in teams as lawyers or as activists or as advocates of any kind. But receiving a pass seeing an opportunity, getting open for it, receive the pass and make the play, that's really what the art form is as for your career. So that's one thing I want to say is, it's less about, here is my path and some people can do the stair step. I'm not one of them who just says, I'm going to do the X and Y and Z and it leads to this, and then I have a midlife crisis. I was much more interested in sort of being open to making the play. The second thing I want to say, and this is sort of a big meta point that has really guided my life that I think was helpful to me, especially when I was in your place of trying to figure out and having all the fear and nervousness about how was I going to build a career in the law. Think about what gives you passion. Think about what are the things that you just pay attention. What are the things that you notice yourself being happy doing? Issues that speak to you or actions that speak to you. So it may be, oh my God, I'm really happy when I'm really thinking about technology and tech-related things. So that's the thing that really feeds me. In my spare time when I don't have to read something, that's what I'm reading about. Or maybe it's about a certain issue. Maybe it's about hunger issues or civil rights and civil liberties and social justice issues. That was for me. But for some people it's music or art. And so whatever it is, the thing that sort of speaks to your soul, pay attention to that. That's really important. That's your life path, right? Everything else, whether you go to a law firm or a nonprofit or a government, those are just platforms. Those are just platforms. And those are going to change throughout your career. And the first platform you go to may not be the one that was your first choice. Don't worry about it. If you have a sense and can continually sort of think about what it is that your path is about, over time, you'll bring the resources of the various platforms that you work at to your path. And ultimately, hopefully, if you're fortunate, and I think most of us can get there, frankly, y'all have already won the golden ticket to the chocolate bar because you're here. So, if you have that ability, you'll bring your life path and your career path together. So for me, I'll just tell the story. When I first got out of law school, I had been a journalist for about 10 years, often in conflict zones. So I was that sparked my interest in human rights and social justice and the law. And in particular, living in a lot of places where a lot of the freedoms that I took for granted growing up in the U.S., things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, relative equality for women, still a long way to go on that, a long way to go on other forms of equality, especially racial equality. But nonetheless, a lot of values and things that I grew up imbibed with. And then I worked in lots of conflict zones and watched failed states and watched where things fell apart and realized how easy it is to lose the values, the freedoms that we can, because they're not, I don't believe, God-given. They're actually made by human beings, and they can be dismantled just as well and protected just as well by human beings. So I decided I wanted to have the tools in the toolkit to not just write about it, but to be able to do something about it. So I came to Harvard Law School, charged up, ready to go, gonna go out and do this, and I sort of learned about more what the work of the ACLU is, which is working in the U.S. domestic constitutional law system. And I like the enforcement mechanism relative to the international human rights system. So I decided I wanted, at least for some period of time, to be able to do that. And in part, it came up, I was in my, during law school, I went over to Sri Lanka and I did some election monitoring. And there's this wonderful Sri Lankan labor organizer, not a lawyer, and he said to me, "This is so great that you've come to Sri Lanka to help us to make sure we have a democracy. Now, what do you do to preserve the democracy in your country?" I was like, oh shit. Like one of those moments of like, I don't know, like what have I done, right? So I came back a little bit of a concern, having been overseas for a long time, about not wanting to fall into the colonialist rubric of I'm going to come over and save your country but do nothing about my own. So I came back saying I want to do something domestically, at least for some portion of my career. And I came out and said, I'm going to go work for the ACLU. So I go, I'm charged up, I go to the ACLU and interview, and the person who interviews me says, "Hey, you'll never get a job here. Like, there's only 5 people who work here. We've all worked here 15 years. Nobody's leaving, nobody's coming. Best of luck. But would you like to be a cooperating attorney?" I was like, oh, okay. Guess there's not an opening there. Felt like the door kind of slammed shut. Right, so I went off to a law firm. I clerked for a judge and I went to a law firm and picked the law firm because it had a good First Amendment practice, and I'd been a journalist, so I understood about the first freedom of speech and freedom of the press was an interest to me, part of my life path, right? And so went there, and also went there because I was going to learn a huge amount about how to practice law, the profession of the law, how to write a great brief, how to do civil procedure, how to do, understanding the rules of evidence, how to do a deposition, how to do a trial, all of the things that you need to, that you study in law school, that you need to practice the craft. You need to apprentice. That was for me a great apprenticeship, to be at a law firm. And I started doing a lot, I did ACLU cases, I did cases with the PAIR project, which does immigration work, I did cases with volunteer lawyers for the arts, because I'm interested in the arts. I did environmental cases to see if I liked environmental law, so I kept trying from the law firm to think about my life path, but I was on this platform of the law firm, and I had a great time at the law firm. I was there for 6 years. It was a very good practice. It made me a really skilled professional lawyer at the craft of law. And I just think that was something that I really, at the time I probably would have liked to go right to the ACLU, but I'm really glad I did that in retrospect, in the rearview mirror, because it gave me training that a lot of people who go directly into nonprofits don't always have. We do now, because I came in and I was like, how do we do conflicts checks? And they're like, we don't. And I was like, oh my God, yes we do. Now we do. When the executive director position opened up at the ACLU, which is the person who oversees the lawyers, but also oversees the communications department, and I've been a journalist, and the funding and the financing and the every aspect of in the field program, the legislative program. So it's a different kind of job. And I thought, I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring. And I ended up being lucky enough to get the job, and I could go back to that person who didn't hire me and say, hey, remember when you said I'd never work here? And I could actually fire you and make myself the staff attorney. I have to say, I'm always really nice to our interns, because I'm like, I might be working for you someday. You just never know how the world can turn out.
This is an important lesson.
Be nice. No, but the reality of it is, in all honesty, the person who said that to me is a great lawyer and a great friend, and just retired, but worked with me for 15 years, more years, and is a better staff attorney than I would have been, and I'm a better executive director than she would have been. So I mean, everybody wins. The stars align in the long run. But it's not as though I set out going, I'm going to become the executive director of the ACLU. For me, it was much more about what are the things that interest me. And by the way, when that job came open, because I had done cases as a cooperating attorney, right, the search committee looked at that and said, oh my gosh, you've been doing cases with us. You've been becoming an expert on constitutional law and civil liberties. You know how we work. And it did set me up to do the job as the executive director. But it's not as though you sit in a room and you map out your path and it all works according to plan. It never did for me. But keeping in mind what your life path is and what are the things that really move you, and then just whatever platform you manage to land on, take it, direct it back. My firm ultimately went under in the crash of, actually before the crash, like 2003, and I'm pretty sure it's because I did so much pro bono work, but I've never actually taken that.
That is not why it went under. Although, this is a subject for another day. It was a firm that I think never fully recognized that the legal profession was changing. And was a very old style, kind of gentlemanly in that, old way, noblesse oblige kind of law firm. But its alumni are pretty fantastic, including our former governor, now presidential candidate.
Bill Well, that Governor Dukakis was there.
Yeah, no, it trained many great leaders because it was a great firm. So, partly in all seriousness, it's to say not all law firms are the same.
No.
And those of you looking around, thinking you might want to work at a law firm for a couple of years while you think about doing something like the ACLU or the Legal Defense Fund or the Environmental Defense Fund, look around and pay attention to how law firms are different, because they are different in that respect. Carol, there's so many issues that you are now dealing with, but one I know that is of particular interest to many people in this room revolves around the whole issue around immigration and visa issues, and one that is particularly relevant to students, maybe some of these students in this room, is student visas, which are now really, under attack in a way. I mean, as you know better than anybody, there was a Harvard student trying to come in from Iran who was turned back at the airport, notwithstanding a court order and whatnot. So maybe if you could use that to talk a little bit about that issue, but maybe use it as a way to talk about the kind of work that you guys do and how you try to do what you said, what the guy charged you with, which is how are we enforcing our constitutional rights and our law in this country?
So, huge question, and we are doing a huge amount of immigration work at the ACLU, including with the students who are being turned back at the airport from Iran. Man, there's so much happening. So let me just a step back, and many of you maybe have heard of the ACLU before. We're a 100-year-old organization. But let me just tell you a little bit about how we operate because it's kind of unique. So the ACLU is membership funded. So we have people, and it's $20 to be a member for a year. So it's sort of a crowdsourced thing, but it's 100 years old, so it's been around for a long time. And we do what we call integrated advocacy. So there's sort of three aspects to our secret sauce. One is that we do integrated advocacy. The second is that we're confederated nationally and across the states. And the third is that we're multi-issue. So let me talk about those three aspects, and then I'll talk about immigration.
Please.
So the integrated advocacy model is we're a law reform organization. So we don't do direct legal services. So when people come in and their rights are violated, we have an intake system, but we take very few cases that way. We usually refer them out to legal services or to the to the public defender system. So we do law reform. We're saying if we see a problem, yes, we have an individual client case in controversy. You need that to get into court. But we're looking for cases and controversies that will change the system of oppression. So we're always looking for systemic reform. And when we find that we want to change something and do systemic reform, we lay out a plan and we talk about what's the litigation option, what's the legislative option, both in the state legislature and in the Congress, what's the communication strategy that backs that up, what's the field strategy to mobilize people who may be calling their legislators or showing up at court. And then we have fundraising and finance. Those are sort of our departments, but we integrate those across. So we set a goal to challenge some wrongdoing in the system when we want systems change. And if we can have a check mark in each of those boxes, we win. It's just really fun. We didn't used to do that. When I first got there, that was like, we just play defense. I was like, well, that's really boring. I don't want to play. I mean, we kill a lot of bad things, but I want to actually make the world better. So whether it was on equal marriage, which we were the lead on in a lot of ways on that, or on changing the public records law, which sounds small but is actually huge. It's about government transparency, or about immigrants' rights or women's rights. All of these issues, we do the same applied tools in the toolkit. And if we can have litigation, legislative, field, and communications integrated and aligned, we punch above our weight. And that's a really new thing for new lawyers who come here, because they're like, what do you mean I have to talk to the communications people? Like, what is that? Or work with the organizers. But we all know that judges are not calling balls and strikes. They're political people who wake up and read the newspaper in the morning, right? They're affected. When their courtroom gets full of people, you bet they pay different kind of attention to what's going on. And then it enables people to say that the courts belong to them too. So it's part of our social justice mission to give greater agency and involvement of people whose lives are impacted by the bad law reform stuff, or the need for law reform, and bringing their voices to the table to recognize the agency that they have in this conversation. So it's not like we're there to fix them or save them. They're saving themselves and we're just a resource to them, right? So it's a very different kind of mindset than in a lot of other kinds of practices of law. So that's the integrated advocacy model. The second thing we have is a confederated model. So there's a national ACLU, and then each state has a state ACLU. When somebody gives their $20 or gives money to the ACLU, 50 cents goes to the national organization and 50 cents stays in the local state. 25 states are too poor to actually raise enough money. So of the 50 cents that goes to the national organization, that goes out to all the other, like Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, you go on and on and on. And that funds their programs. And as a result of the fact that we share money, we don't fight about program. And it enables us to then be strategic at a nationwide level to say, what is the litigation that we want to bring to challenge? And so immigration is a huge example because that's a federal issue. But the cases and controversies take place in states. So how do we make sure that if we're bringing a case here in Massachusetts, it aligns with what the national organization and the other states are doing so that we have a more integrated model? So that's the second. So we have integrated advocacy, a confederated system that enables us, and it's kind of webby. In other words, I don't work for the national ACLU. We're independent. I don't need their permission to bring a case. I have my own board of directors that I work for. But because we share the money, we don't fight about money. In other words, if they raise $1 here, I get half. If I raise $1 here, they get half. So if Anthony Romero, the National Executive Director, wants to come and tuck some bazillionaire out of their money, I'm like, great, we get half. Can I help you? Would you like some coffee? So because we have that confederated model, I think it makes us usually both dynamic and robust at the same time, because we have this flexibility to be on the ground and to think nationally. And then the third thing, is multi-issue. Right, and there's so much intersectionality. So, there's simply no way, for example, to talk about reproductive justice without thinking about the implications for people of color and poor people who are most frequently the targets. You can say it's Roe versus Wade makes it legal, but if you set up barriers so that people in poor areas can't get access, then all you've done is to say that rich people have access to reproductive justice and not poor people, right? So you have to intersect all of our issues. When we talk about technology in the service of liberty and the implications for having big databases that track people, who's going to be targeted first? Immigrants, right? Because the strength of the government is strongest at the borders, because there's the courts have recognized greater executive branch authority on things like visas. And so the intersectionality. So on one hand, we have all these issues that we work on set forth in the Bill of Rights. And I always think of it like a stove. I really love to cook as my thing to relax. So, it used to be before Trump that, you'd have something on the back burner kind of on a simmer and something over here, and there maybe one thing on the boil that you decided to take on. We're gonna have a campaign of fix the public records law. That was one, Now it's like, everything's boiling all the time. Like, oh my God. So that's what it's been like the last couple of years to do that. So on immigration, so right after Trump was elected, he got up, well, actually before he was elected, we were doing strategic planning for it in the event that he was elected. And I have to say, there were a lot of people like, well, we all know Hillary's gonna win, why are we doing this? And it's like, yeah, I'm just so glad. And we're, by the way, doing it again. We're doing strategic planning for the Plan A and Plan B. Plan R and Plan B. For November, because we're nonpartisan, so we don't endorse candidates. Anyways, because we have to deal with whoever is in power. So right after the Muslim ban, right here, we were the first affiliate to go out to Logan and to challenge the Muslim ban. And we were able to do that in part because we're nimble on the ground because we're a state-based organization right now. And because we have Harvard and Northeastern and BC and BU and all these colleges that really need immigrants, students, and want to have that. It's part of our ecosystem, our economic and social ecosystem of Boston is to have immigrants here. So we knew that we were going to be able to have allies and partners, and we're all about movement building. So we went out with immigration lawyers on the front lines, people who do the cases, sort of like, we do a lot with like legal service lawyers and immigration lawyers who are on the front lines. They have cases, they don't have the resources to do the big structural litigation. And then we also work with big law firms, cooperating attorneys, because they have even more resources. And to do these cases, you got to have a lot of resources and a lot of people working together. So we aligned up. People came to the airports. We went into court. It was an incredible night. It was a Saturday, and so to get into court, to get an injunction, everybody had to do their job, and everybody did their job. It was actually, it's hard for me to talk about. It's emotional, but the guy, the clerk had to open the courthouse. The marshal had to be there to unlock the door. And we're talking about 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday. 2 emergency judges showed up, right, to hear our case. The media showed up. God bless them. Both of them. The media showed up. Everybody did their job. Everybody did their job. It was great. It was patriotic. It felt very patriotic. And we got a preliminary injunction, a nationwide preliminary injunction. It only lasted 1 week because then we pulled a bad judge and he reversed the injunction a week later. But in that interim, other ACLUs and other organizations filed lawsuits, and there were 12 total lawsuits across the country, right? That ultimately, and what we did, even though ultimately, we forced the Trump administration to twice revamp the policy to not be so clearly as racist, so we at least sort of hoisted them, but we bought a lot of time. We bought months for people to be reunited with their families, to, figure out their visa situation. So a lot of times time is an important aspect of what we do in these cases, just to buy time for people not to be repressed so quickly. A series of cases since. So my friend and colleague Legal Learned at the National ACLU has reunited about 5,556 children who were separated from their parents at the border. And then has also filed lawsuits now to try to get medical care and trauma care for them. So that's like the big ACLU story that you hear about a lot. The stuff that's happening, but it's not just on the border, it's also happening here. So we had a case where they came in and sent, last August, and they sent letters to children who have terminal illnesses who are in hospitals in Massachusetts saying they had 30 days to leave. Like it's unbelievable cruelty. We managed with integrated advocacy to push that policy back. So first we went into court, then we went down to Congress. It's got Ayanna Pressley involved, we got other people involved. Again, integrated advocacy. We went to the media, we told the story. You don't just assume, it's not like the Warren Court where you go to court and fix it, right? It's not like, it's really integrated. We managed to get that rolled back, at least for now. But the level of cruelty is crazy. We just had the case with the Iranian students who were being pushed back, so we were in the courts on that last week. Means going down to Logan Airport and just showing up, and it was crazy. The Custom and Border Patrol guys were like, we refuse to let you see your client, and they all turned their backs on us. It was just like, wow, that's crazy, you know? So that kind of stuff goes there. And then most recently, and I want to tell you about one case, and then I'll be quiet. This is just happening. And it's really important that you all know about it, because I think it's from a structural law reform, one of the biggest things we can do on immigration. And that is this return to Mexico policy, the migrant protection protocols that the Trump administration is putting out. So what happened is, because groups like the ACLU were suing because the kids were being put into these ice boxes, these detentions down on the border, so we were suing like bringing Eighth Amendment conditions, challenges and things like that. So the Trump administration last July decided that they wouldn't let anybody seeking asylum or immigration status come into the country. They would push them back into Mexico. They call them the migrant protection protocols, but it's really the return to Mexico policy. So there's this family, Maudie and Hans Costanza. They were in Guatemala, kind of a 30-something family, 3 little kids, fairly bougie, you know, as Guatemalans are, can be. But Hans went out and he witnessed a murder, a shooting. And they saw him, and so they shot him as a witness. And he got shot 4 times, but he didn't die. And they thought, oh my God, we need to flee, right? So they decided to bring their kids across the border and to flee, and because they have relatives in Massachusetts. So they came to the bridge at Nuevo Laredo, and they decided to break up and have Maudie and the 2 girls go, and then Hans and his little boy, Hansito, come across separately, because if you send dad with the kids, then they often take dad into detention and let mom go with the kids. So this was a way to make sure the whole family got across, and people know how to do this. I mean, people who are immigrants are often incredibly resourceful, because that's how they managed to get here. In the time period, so Maudie and the 2 little girls who are 3 and 5 came across on, I'm thinking July 6th. On the 13th, Hans and Hansito came across. On the 10th is when the migrant protection protocols went in. So right in that period in between, they changed the rules. So when Hans came across with Hansito, Custom and Border Patrol said, you may not come into the U.S. The way that it works is, if you are a victim of persecution, you present yourself at the U.S. border and you say, I'm fleeing for my life, I seek asylum. So this is an asylum case. You get a credible fear hearing, and as did Maudie did, and she comes up to Ashland to be with the extended family up here. Hans and Hansito get there and they say, no, you have to go across the bridge. Across the Nuevo Laredo Bridge is a town called Tamaulipas. In Tamaulipas, it's so dangerous that the U.S. State Department has given it a level 4 warning, which is what they give to Syria and Afghanistan right now. So it's really dangerous, and the gangs particularly prey on the migrants, and particularly on bougie-looking migrants like Hans and Maudie, because they get ransom. So it's just a criminality thing. There are 60,000 similarly situated people. They're living in tent encampments in Mexico that our government has pushed back over the border. So Hans and Hansito say, we won't go, we're too afraid. And they sit on the bridge and cry. And one of the legal standards is whether your client has demonstrated a credible fear of being returned. Pretty strong facts. So they spent the night on the bridge, and the next morning Customs and Border Patrol said to Hans and Hansito, if you do not cross back into Tamaulipas, we will take your child away. And you'll never see him again. So they did. They went across. And when they got across, they went and they didn't have anywhere to go, so they went into like an immigration services center. And the second or third day after, they were staying there, like in the lobby. And then the second day, they went out and somebody tried to kidnap the child, Hansito. And they tried to shove him in a car. And so just by chance, some Mexican soldiers came around and they didn't get kidnapped, but they were like completely re-traumatized. So at this point, they went into hiding in the basement and they wouldn't go out of the center. Fortunately, Maudie was up here with the extended family, and through their church in Ashland, Massachusetts, they found a pastor in Mexico who could take Hans and Hansito into his basement, into hiding. So they were living in hiding in the basement of a pastor in Mexico. When Maudie came to us, we were like, whoa, we want to challenge these MPP, these Mexican protection protocols. Now, the ACLU in California has filed a lawsuit challenging at a facial challenge. They didn't have a client because you can't get a client. You don't have somebody here, and they can't get across to be a client. That's the point. That's why they're doing it that way. So they have a challenge representing like social service agencies that they won at the federal court level, the trial court level. It's on appeal, unfortunately. The Ninth Circuit took it up, and that's maybe a bad sign. We're not sure what's going to happen, so it's pending in the Ninth Circuit. But we filed this case because it's such a strong case on the facts, and we were ready to go to court. We were going to court last Friday, just last week, and on Wednesday, Homeland Security called and said, yeah, we're letting him out, we're letting him go. They didn't want this case. They don't want these facts. You know, good facts make good law, bad facts make bad law. They didn't want these facts. So we had this amazing reunion at Logan Airport with the family on Thursday, and there's all these questions. Do you have television cameras there or not? Are you re-traumatizing your clients if you do that? But it's telling their story, an important way to challenge and get more stories told. And I mean, these are the ethical questions that we have to then confront of how do we go forward, how do we do this law reform. I'll end by just saying there was this fabulous moment. The family is unbelievably wonderful. When Hans's sister, who's been here for 30 years, she says in front of the camera, she goes, I have been here for 30 years in Massachusetts. I'm a home health aide. What does that mean? That means I wash your old people. I was just like, wow, great. Like, doesn't get more real. Yeah. You know, I washed your old people. Like, hello. So we've got that. So we're doing a whole lot of, we have cases where married couples, we're going into Office of U.S. Citizenship to get their, one is married, one is a U.S. citizen, one is not, and they go in to get their status regularized, and then they say, yep, you have a legitimate marriage, and then they lock up one of them. And we did a class action, we got that to stop. We found that they were doing it intentionally, like in discovery. We found emails between ICE and Immigration Customs Enforcement and the Office of Citizenship, where they were saying, let's spread these out so groups like the ACLU don't find out. It was like, oh my God. And I'll just end with one. And so it matters who your judges are, but the judges are human beings. And just always remember that. You're not dealing with balls and strikes. You're dealing, and everything is political. Everything is real. And we're in with this judge, and it's right before Mother's Day. And our client had been separated from her children. She'd been in prison for 4 months at the time. And so we're in court, it's Mother's Day, it's the Thursday before Mother's Day, and the judge says, can we have a scheduling conference next Tuesday? And the lawyer for the government says, no, I'm gonna be home visiting my mom in Texas. And the judge said, you're gonna be home visiting your mother. These children haven't seen their mother. And we have the kids in court. Why don't you take a recess and decide whether you and they are going to spend Mother's Day with their mothers, or none of you are. And our clients got out, their kids got out, the mom got out that day. But that's how not calling balls and strikes it is. That's how real it is when you're dealing with judges. So that's why it matters to do integrated advocacy, because they read the paper. They see who's in the courtroom. It's not, the law is not neutral, right? It's very real. And so the approach that we take on immigration and on the other issues that we work on, it's very integrated, it's very real, and it's really meaningful. It just is great.
So Carol, I'm just gonna ask one more
Yeah,
question,
sorry, I'm talking
but no, you're not talking, this is incredible, but I just wanna put the students on notice that you'll have your chance to ask too. And the question I have is really a question about students, which is the model you have given, let's just kind of say it in a nice way, it's not exactly what we teach at Harvard Law School. You know, we don't actually
Yes.
teach people how to think about the law in this way. And so one part of the question is, what should these students, if they're interested in this, do to prepare themselves? How, you know, what advice would you have for them? And the other part is also very real, because how do you and your lawyers sustain yourselves in circumstances which victories are, I mean, you've given us wonderful victories, but my guess is most days are not filled with wonderful victories. They're filled with setbacks and defeats and frustrations, and the courts are becoming more and more conservative, and the hostility is growing. How do you sustain yourself? So maybe, you know, kind of first advice for them about how to prepare themselves, and then maybe also how to think about how they sustain themselves in the long term for this kind of work.
That's great. Well, I mean, first of all, like, study what you care about. I mean, you know, if tax law is your thing, that could be great for law reform, because, like, that's where the money is. You know what I mean? There isn't an area of law that doesn't have from my point of view, that doesn't have an implication for social justice if you want to do it, right? So, or if it's environment, everything has an implication. So that's the beauty of the law, is like all of the different types of law. I mean, one of the other things I do a lot of work on is artificial intelligence and civil liberties. So that's like my other area of interest, which is way friggin' different. But every aspect, every type of law can be used to the things that you believe in. That's what makes it such a powerful tool, right? To apply to the things you care about in the world. So I would think about spending more time, a combination of thinking about what are the things you really care about that you want to spend your one wild and precious life working on, and then get all the tools you can. Be as great a lawyer as you can possibly be, right? But also think about outside of the law, what's happening, you know, in the thing that you care about. So I mean, if your area is, you know, visual arts, you know, just pay attention to what's happening there, because your tools are just the tool, but you want to know the environment you're working in. So I would say it's about paying attention to your own self, to your psyche, which kind of goes also to the question of how do we keep at it. You know, like, I kind of don't have time for despair, and I'm lucky because we have I get to work on a platform that enables me to address it, but I think all of us can use our platforms. You know, we're all friends, we're all neighbors, we're all teachers, we all have a place that we can push towards the things we care about and build the world that we care about. I do have to say, the other day when we had the reunion of Hans and Maudie and the family, and it was just so moving, all these lawyers from ALA, American Immigration Law Association, who were the frontline people just doing cases day in and day out, they started, somehow the word got out and they started showing up at the airport. And I know many of them. I was like, what are all these people doing? They're like, this isn't their case. Like, what are they doing here? And one of them said to me, we need to come when there's a victory once in a while. It's so rare. We need to be here. And, you know, it's like really interesting. And I was like, oh, great. Like, be here. There's a generosity of spirit of sharing in the victories. One of the things that drives me nuts is when social justice groups fight with each other or think there's a limited pie. It's like, no, believe me, the rich have enough money to pay for all of us. There's enough. But we need to work together. And when we work together, it inspires people to actually then give us money and do stuff. But I just recently, by way of example, I was thinking about the secondary trauma stuff. And coming actually out of the Logan Airport reunion last week, and I was thinking, I really need to think about this for my people, but also for other lawyers who are part of the movement to do this work. And I called my friend over at Jane Doe, which is a domestic violence survivors group, and she's developed a whole curriculum. So I'm going to work with her and with the ALA and these other groups to see if we can maybe provide something. So it's a little bit like, if you don't find the resources, then build it, figure it out. And other people often, you know, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, Jane Doe already invented that part, and then somebody called me yesterday and said the social workers want to do something. So all of a sudden, other people are going to own it, and I'm going to be like, "Isn't that great?" And I won't do it myself. But inspiring others, aligning others. So that's to me the way to do it. It's really about thinking of yourself and caring for yourself, but thinking beyond to the world that you want to build.
Well, I hope you've been inspired to ask questions. This is an amazing opportunity to talk to somebody who has, yes, please. And if you would just say your name and maybe, what year you are, but just so Carol has a, sense of where you come
So I'm Laura Takshid. I'm actually a newest fellow here at the law school. It's a postdoctoral fellowship.
Great.
I'm from Iran. So first of all, thank you for everything you've done these past 2 years.
Thank you.
In between those time that you bought for the travel ban, my in-laws who hadn't seen my brother-in-law for like five years or more were able to get a visa and come visit and
Great.
Wow.
Oh,
that was
that's
like,
great.
that was huge, and they were literally running to get the visa before everything changes.
Exactly.
So,
Oh,
thank you for
great
that
news.
reunion. But as Professor was mentioning, a lot is also going on right now again on the visas itself. So
Yes.
like I'm thinking if if it was today, I don't know if they could have with a visa even entered the U.S.
Right.
And I'm wondering, I heard that you mentioned you already have a case on this, but since the project, the ACLU sees itself as a law reforming institution, isn't this the perfect way to challenge the consular non-reviewability doctrine that, I've had even like a Harvard SJP student here who was denied visa, sued the government basically for not giving her the visa, not giving her answer after a year because it was in delay, just no answer, and then she sued and the court just said, I'm sorry, it turned out that the case was moot because once she sued the US Department of State, they just rejected the visa right away. But,
Right.
which sounded like kind of like a I don't know what to say, but anyway, that and I don't know, as
Well, we're looking to challenge that, right? So we just had this case we just had a couple weeks ago. It was crazy. Like when they turned their backs on us, and then they lied and they put them on a plane. And then and then the judge came in. It was crazy. And then the judge came in and said, "Well, do we need to have a hearing? There's no case." We were like, "What?" Yeah, because they could do it to other people, right? And we just pulled a bad judge. Literally, we just pulled a bad judge. But there's another case of a Harvard Divinity School student. Who I think that case is still ongoing. And so, if you lose on one, you just have to keep going on the others because you're working for everybody. But to show how, and this sort of goes to, do they still teach critical race theory here?
No,
Yeah.
actually,
No.
this is, yes, but there's a big issue about whether or not there's gonna be a full-time person here.
Oh,
This is a big
wow.
issue among
Things have
students, I think.
so,
So there
there you
is
go.
some, but yes.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that it depends on the judge you get and like what they're, it's not, again, balls and strikes, right? So if you get a good judge, you can make good law, and when you get a bad judge, it's hard to make good law because, that's how it works. So you have to just keep bringing challenges until you can actually break through. And right now, with the courts growingly conservative, we're still pretty good here in Massachusetts in the First Circuit with our trial court judges, but I am worried. That's why it really matters who gets elected in November, not because we're partisan, but because if you're having judges who are going to be so deferential to executive branch power, and what's really crazy when you think about the power that they defer to Customs and Border Patrol, CPU says that it runs 100 miles from any border. That would be all of Massachusetts except the Berkshires, right? It's crazy, right? And so then you start thinking, are there other ways to challenge it? Maybe you want to challenge it on behalf of the U.S. citizens who says they don't want to be subject to Customs and Border Patrol. So what you're talking about requires us to have constant strategic revisioning, rethinking about how we can position ourselves. But you also have to have a case in controversy. You have to have a client. And if you can't get the client because the client's in Mexico or in Iran, and you can't get jurisdiction that a court will recognize, you have to start to think even more creatively. So what you're talking about is exactly the kind of stuff that there are people right now working on and looking at all the cases. And it's not, that's the craft of the law. And that's why becoming a great lawyer, it's not enough to be a political person and follow your passion. Also have to get the tools to understand the jurisdictional arguments, to understand your options, to understand how to do that. That's the real fun. It's really interesting and it's really hard legal litigation, legal work. And so the case that you're calling about, I can't tell you, here's the easy answer. What I can tell you is there are a lot of lawyers right now, and we're meeting and we're talking about it, and we're working on it, trying to figure out the best cases, the best clients, and how to get jurisdiction to challenge the underlying executive branch unfettered power that seems to be at work here at the board. But it's hard.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a 2L. I'm actually going to be interning with you this summer.
Oh, hi Daniel, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. In First Amendment class this semester, one of the ways the ACLU has come up has been in the context of defending the First Amendment rights of Nazis in Skokie or in Charlottesville with neo-Nazis. And so how do you view ACLU Massachusetts' relationship with ACLU National and with regards to choosing clients?
Thanks for picking an easy question. So, back in the, was it 60s or 70s?
Skokie was 77.
There was this question about can the neo-Nazis march through a overwhelmingly Jewish community? And yes, the ACLU is out there to defend hate speech. And a lot of people at the ACLU, especially old timers, kind of go, well, weren't we great? We were so, and a lot of them got the wrong lesson. I mean, the lesson should have been you stand for the principle, no matter the client. Instead, they kind of got this lesson like, if we have really bad clients, then we must be right. Which is like, no, I want Monty and Hans. I mean, I don't want bad clients, I want to make good law. So when the ACLU of Charlottesville made an independent decision that they were going to represent the neo-Nazis and their right to have a march down in Charlottesville, I would say, from a First Amendment perspective, it was not a hard call. They have a right to march. It was a little ahistorical, shall we say, in terms of what's going on in the world with Black Lives Matter and Occupy and all the other things that are going on. A week late, I'll tell you what we did, because I don't want to judge my fellow ED down in Charlottesville, because I wasn't down there, it's not for me to decide. So they came to the Boston Common a week later, right? And I was like, oh shit, so we got calls from the neo-Nazis to represent them. We got calls from the other side, from the Trotskyites and the Maoists. Yeah. And like, who knew they were still around? I was like, oh my God, this is so great. And I said, wow, let's represent the media. So what happened is, Billy Evans, who was then the police commissioner, went on TV and he said, we're not gonna let the media get on here because we don't want those nasty Nazi sentiments being broadcast out to anybody. So we're gonna ban the media. And I was like, yes! My client is the First Amendment. And we're conflicted from representing anybody else. Right? Because we already have a client. So we represented the media. And then we marched with the 70,000 people who marched against white supremacy, because I believe that the ACLU, we're going to defend free speech, and we do a lot of great free speech work I'm very proud of, but we also have an obligation to raise our own collective voice as an organization that also believes in equality and march for equality and against white supremacy. So we did that too. Those are really hard cases. I think the one thing that makes everything different and really different between Skokie and Charlottesville, and where the national ACLU ultimately ended coming down on, was they were armed. And when you have open carry laws, when you have the Second Amendment being interpreted in a way that it actually violates First Amendment free speech rights, I'm afraid to go because I'm afraid you will shoot me. Right? There's an interesting tension when those rights are in conflict. That it didn't happen in Skokie. And in Skokie, there was no question about it. They didn't have guns. There was no open carry in Skokie, right? This is really different because now you have people who are actually armed and dangerous. And I think that, so the more recent, what is it, in North Carolina or Virginia? Yeah, when they were saying, can you have a ban bringing guns into the area? I'm like, yes, you can, like, my perspective. And they did that here on Boston Common. They had, like, you couldn't bring weapons and stuff. And I'm like, I don't see a constitutional right being violated when they're keeping the public safe by saying you can't bring weapons on. ACLUs in Wyoming and Texas may have a real different view on open carry. I understand their board meetings are more polite than mine. So, because they have open carry board meetings. But so anyway, I think it's a really hard issue, but given the amount of work that we now do on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and the systems that we've set up in our whole process, that every case that we take goes through an equity review. So we think about the implications of those cases. That note, I do want to say one thing, and I would recommend a great book by Erwin Chemerinsky, Erwin with an E, Erwin Chemerinsky.
The Dean at Berkeley.
Dean at Berkeley.
And my former high school debate partner.
No way! Erwin was?
True.
Oh, I love him. Anyway, so
amazing.
he's amazing.
I was the dead weight on them.
Hardly. But it's called Free Speech on Campus. And what Irwin talks about at the very beginning of this book, and it's a great book, he talks about how people from my generation thought about free speech when there were efforts to try to silence Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and silence, and Harry Belafonte and his people were brought up on couldn't buy an ad. That was New York Times v. Sullivan, the seminal First Amendment case. Or when Stokely Carmichael was trying to go to Berkeley and it wasn't allowed, and there was the free speech movement, right? Then free speech was about enabling the civil rights movement, enabling people who were being repressed to raise their voice and to be heard, right? But for my children's generation, that wasn't really an issue, because it was really, for them, it was the equal marriage, the gay rights movement. There were some free speech issues around ACT UP and stuff, but mostly it was an equality era. And then there was the internet, and you get cyberbullying, and speech is suddenly very changed. And we have this conversation where we sort of have a false juxtaposition, a false dichotomy between free speech and equality. And I think it's more of a dialectic. And that we need to begin to listen to each other across the generations and not sort of form our camps, that you're either for free speech or you're for equality. Well, no, I'm for both. And I'll just end, one of our big free speech cases we've been doing is the right to panhandle, the right to beg. And one of the arguments that we were able to make is if the courts are recognizing, or if the court are asserting that a corporation is free speech and money is speech, then surely a human being saying, brother, can you spare a dime, must be protected. And so a lot of the work we've done has to do with that. I'll just, a funny thing, so we won this case, it was amazing. It was Worcester, Massachusetts, and Lowell, two places where apparently the city officials were stubborn and stupid. And so the case went all the way up, the right to beg went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and they still didn't settle or dismiss. So it went back down. So by the time we finally won, the fees, because we worked with a big law firm, the fees were like $2 million, right? And it's the case that gives attorney's fees. So my lawyers come in there like, boss, we're really worried, like we're gonna put in this application for, $2 million in attorney's fees, and we're worried about the bad press, because these are kind of depressed towns with a lot of beggars, and what should we do, and how should we deal with that? And I was like, you say that we will defend the right of those city officials to beg for our fees day in and day out. They can do that anytime they want. We'll be there for them. We ended up settling for a whole lot less, many, many millions less. But those things happen. But the free speech and race dichotomy is a really hard one and one that we struggle with. But I think we struggle with it with the transparency and an open-mindedness and open-heartedness that enables us to get to the right place. Good hard question.
Yeah, that hasn't changed. We have the best students.
You all do. You are the best students. I think we're
Any other questions or thoughts? I know that people may have to. Please.
Yeah, if you have to leave, please do.
Yeah.
I'll stick around.
So this is, firstly, I completely resonate with what you said about how easy, I'm Maithili, I'm an LLM student from India, and I resonate with how you said it's just so easy for democratic freedoms and values to disappear, because I'm here and I feel like I left a different country, and when I go back at the end of this year, I'm going back to a very different one.
Yes. Yes.
But I know you've done a lot of work in South Asia, and I was just wondering, so back home we look at the ACLU as a model that is synonymous with social justice in the United States.
Right.
But when I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people in India, but the difficulty we face is with the funding model.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know of too many or any organization that has the kind of crowdfunding model that has enabled ACLU to do all the work that it is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So based on your experience in South Asia, and for people who want to do this kind of work, just like you said, going back home and contributing to your country, would you have any suggestions, especially in the South Asian context, on what funding models could look like?
Yeah, no, and it's really true, and it's really culturally bound in terms of going to people and saying, hey, we're not charging you for our services, but you should just join because we're protecting everybody's rights, and people are kind of like, yeah, no, it's hard. I would say, from my perspective, probably the best funding model for South Asia would probably be to go to a lot of the foundations and also the international groups, some of the groups like NOVIB, that the EU does a lot of funding in the human rights arena, and trying to do that. Independence of the judiciary, I think, is a really good place, and it's not as, it's vitally important and not as threatening sometimes to be able to get funding. to do that. And so if I were building there, that's where I would be focusing, is really working with the courts to strengthen an independent judiciary. But also mobilizing, I mean, and you know, doing know your rights work with people and helping them find their own voice and their own agency. That's really, really important, but you have to make sure you don't take people and run them into a buzzsaw of oppression. You know, so
No, I
doing
think the
that
challenge
is
even
hard.
with an organization working on independence of judiciary or mobilization, I think a massive limitation is the funds.
Always.
And with the current government, they've actually passed laws to stop foreign funding.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Which is why this crowdfunding model seemed very interesting, but just culturally it's hard for me
I
to
wonder
imagine.
if we should talk, but I wonder if there might also be, think about going to some of your business people who,
Yeah.
because a lot of times there's a business case for civil rights and civil liberties because they want a level playing field and a fairness that's out there. And so if you can get business people involved, they can sometimes underwrite. That's another sort of source of funding that isn't government funding. And making the pitch that if there's a level playing field for human rights and social justice, the businesses have less disruption and the markets work better. It's a little bit of a weird libertarian kind of approach, argument to be made, but I actually think it's true. And we have found in a lot of our work, in fact, on the immigration stuff, a lot of business leaders are behind it because they want people, the colleges want the students to come, the businesses need the doctors and the high-tech people to come. So maybe thinking about that, and the other would be to look at the expat community, well, depending on whether that would be considered foreign funding or not. The people who are still Indian citizens, but who might be based here and be willing to fund it because they've been exposed here.
In our eyes. So I wrote a book on India. I know a little bit.
Oh, good.
Listen, this is amazing, as you can tell, and I want to make sure that, and Carol, maybe could informally chat if anybody wants. I just want to hold this up, that they have this new book been written. It's called Fight of the Century by Michael Chabon and Ayet Waldman, and it's about the first 100 years of the ACLU. It was just reviewed in the Times, very interesting review. I think that the question really is the next 100 years.
It sure is.
And
That's all up
although,
to you guys.
well, we're not going to hold Carol to be there for all of the next 100 years, but I think the start of the next 100 years, as you can see, is in very good hands. So, Carol,
Thank you.